Welcome back to Not the BCFM Politics Show. For those that want to bypass the psychopath in the corner, on the talkradio.org.uk stream and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores. Anything, please, but Google. Also joining us is Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, and on the line from Hungary is George Szamuely. Hi, George. Welcome to the Politics Show.
Hi, Tony. Nice to talk to you again.
It is fantastic to hear your voice, George. And one of the reasons I like to talk to you is because you have a sort of wry approach to many of the things that go on in the world. Because I think for some of us, it's a bit sort of doom and gloom, isn't it? You know, but actually, at the end of the day, whilst things might seem, frightening, horrible, actually, there's a kind of use of fear, I think, in order to try and sort of corral people. But let's start today by just looking at this announcement about Finland joining NATO, because this is quite an important move. Finland was supposed to be neutral, but now, of course, they're right. I mean, of the three big Scandinavian countries, we're not including Denmark, but of those three countries, the Finland is one that butts up right against Russia, not very far at all from St. Petersburg.
Yeah, no, there's no question. Finland was quite lucky, really, to enjoy that neutral status after World War II. Keep in mind, Finland had been aligned with Hitler and had taken part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. They then, after having been defeated, they then dropped out in 1944. They could have been punished like many other of Hitler's allies were punished by having a communist regime imposed on them. But the Soviet Union didn't do that. They essentially gave Finland every latitude to run their own affairs. The only thing that they asked for in return was that Finland pursue a neutralist foreign policy. And that's exactly what Finland managed to do throughout the Cold War. Finland, I think, did very well out of it. It's hard to see in what way any of Finland's rights of sovereignty were impinged upon by the Soviet Union. Now, what they've done now, of course, is essentially by being, as you said, right up against Russia, an 800-mile border now between NATO and Russia. Finland is in the crosshairs. Because if there is to be a war between Russia and NATO, something that was actually pretty much inconceivable during the Cold War, not inconceivable anymore, then Finland will be in the front line. I mean, whether it'll be through a Russian missile attack, whether through Russian invasion, but Finland will not be able to enjoy what they might have enjoyed during the Cold War, which is that they would be able to stay the hell out of it. This time, Finland will be in the front line. So it's hard to see what exactly Finland has gained by this.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Martin, what do you make of Martin Summers?
Well, I think that's I totally agree with what George just said. Jared Diamond wrote a book about how countries can recover from crises like human beings can, and one of the chapters was about Finland and about how they reorganised their thinking about their place in the world at the end of World War II, because, as you say, they were involved in the siege of Leningrad. There was lots of reasons for the Soviets to be quite hostile to them, and by being neutral, they actually became the place for negotiations to take place. So the Helsinki Accords, signed in the 70s in Helsinki, Finland punched way above its weight as a neutral state. And I find it absolutely appalling and inconceivable that the, generally competent left-leaning government in Finland have allowed themselves to be bamboozled into this idiotic decision.
Well, OK, George, what's your thoughts on that? Because it seemed almost as if everybody in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia is clamouring to be in the front line in America's war against the Russians.
Well, you have to keep in mind that there no longer is any kind of a European identity, any appreciation on the part of European leaders that they have interests of their own separate from that of the United States. Any sense that there is a Europe with its own distinctive outlook and there's America with its distinctive outlook, something that used to be the case during the Cold War, when you had during the 1960s with de Gaulle, during the 1970s and 80s with Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and incidentally Helmut Kohl, who was a conservative. There was a distinctive European approach to international. The elites of Europe today are essentially bought and paid for by the United States. They are not in any way representative of the European people. And so they pursue goals that are American goals. They're not goals of Europe. So
no, hang on, because we've just been talking about France and de Gaulle, George, before you popped up. And what is the process by which, since the Second World War, slowly but surely, these European countries have been brought to heel by the Americans? I mean, it's almost happened in a bit kind of in smoke-filled rooms. And what are the institutions? How has this taken place?
Well, obviously, one way is through the World Economic Forum and Davos. And the Americans have poured a lot of money into cultivating a new elite through its various organizations, whether it's the AID, the Agency for International Development, through the State Department. They bring would-be elites to the United States. They wined and dined and entertained there, flattered, and then they go back to their countries and to pursue the Americans' goals. So if you look at these leaders, and Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, the Green, she's a very good example of this. She's totally Americanized. I mean, everything about her is American. She, there's no resemblance to what used to be at least a kind of German leftism or German environmentalism, or the kind of things that one remembers from the Greens of the 1970s and 80s. She's a totally American creature. She sounds American. She, all her ideas are like warmed over cliches from the U.S. State Department. And she said openly, I don't really care very much about what the German voters want. I know what's good for them. And because, she is essentially entirely identifies with the Americans. Now, this woman, this Marin, this Finnish kind of social democrat who may or may not lose office this weekend, she's another one. All these are kind of young leaders who were cultivated by the World Economic Forum, then inserted into their slots. They're all kind of the same. They're all very young. They're quite cute, telegenic. They don't have any ideas at all. They're kind of inserted into their particular slots, and they spout the cliches that the Americans want spouted. And that's why you kind of wonder, how is what Marion is doing in Finland enhancing Finnish national interest? And then you have these people in the Baltics as well, who are screaming about, Russia is this, Russia that. Well, I mean, if you're really worried about Russia, if you feel there's a threat from Russia, doesn't it make sense for you to try to make friends with Russia? I mean, if you're afraid of somebody, you don't try to antagonize them, but they go out of the way to antagonize Russia because that's what's expected of them. That their masters, the people who have cultivated them and invested money in them, that's what they want from them.
Yeah, we were hearing from Jeffrey Sachs last week, George, that actually he believes anyway that the conflict in Ukraine is really more about the ultimate aim of it is to knock Russia out of the way because America wants to deal with the Chinese.
Well, I mean, I think there's some truth in that. It's not so much that the Americans are worried about China. I think they're worried about Russia and China together. They want to break up that.
Yeah, but they're forcing the two together.
Of course, that's their problem. What the Americans are calculating is that they can bring Russia to its knees. I mean, that's really what they're doing in Ukraine. I mean, they couldn't care less about Ukraine. They're ready to kill every single Ukrainian on the face of the earth if they think that it gets them to their end, which is to bring Russia to its knees, topple Putin, and who knows then what happens? Disintegration of the country. All of Russia's natural resources are up for grabs. That's the goal. And then once Russia is out of the way, they can deal with China. But they regard that if Russia and China are together, then those two powers together are just far too strong for the United States and NATO. So they need to break them up and they're going to do it by essentially trying to destroy Russia. That's their ultimate objective: regime change in Moscow.
I think that is their objective, but it seems that they're not actually succeeding.
Well, they're
for
on
various reasons.
a hiding to nothing, aren't they?
Well, they're not on a hiding to nothing, because if your goal is to make trouble, then that's quite easy to do, isn't it? You don't necessarily have to have a positive outcome.
Surely,
you just make life miserable for people.
Well, okay, but surely the idea is to turn the Russian people against their president. That's going to be a very, very awkward. It's a big ask, because actually he's much more popular than any of the Western leaders.
Well, that's true, and in any case, even if Putin went, the political conditions in Russia will not necessarily lead to a pro-Western regime. It just won't.
Right. No, I think that's obviously right. But the way the Americans think, they think that if this war goes on and Russia continues to lose manpower, obviously sort of loses wealth, and Russia is not actually achieving victory, then the people will turn against Putin. That's the Americans' calculation. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that's how the Americans figure. And then, Putin will be toppled. Now, I agree. What happens then is up for grabs, because it may be that if Putin is toppled, if he's replaced by a leadership that say, look, Putin is just not a wartime leader. He's past it. He doesn't know how to win this war. Then whoever takes over is going to pursue that war. I mean, they're not just going to allow the country to disintegrate. I mean, I would assume there will be somebody who will say, we need to mobilize the country's resources, we need to run a war economy, and we need full mobilization. We need to win this war. I think that's what any post-Putin leadership will insist on. So I think the Americans are making a miscalculation if they think, oh, great, Putin will be gone and the country would just simply disintegrate. I don't think that that's all happen.
No. Well, let's go over to the heart of the problem, really, which is the belly of the beast, if you want, the empire itself over in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we've had some pretty amazing announcements this week. There's been attempts with Boris Johnson to haul him over the coals last week in a rather tame manner about Partygate, but rather more serious cases in the United States. Of course, this is not the only attempt that there's been to prosecute Donald Trump. It seems the obvious objective of this is for the criminal justice system in the United States to stop him standing for president. But anyway, let's have a listen now to a rally, which is what Donald Trump was doing in Waco in Texas this week, because he had quite a lot to say about the deep state.
The stakes of this election could not be more clear. Either we surrender to the demonic forces abolishing and demolishing and happily doing so our country, or we defeat them in a landslide on November 5th, 2024. Either the deep state destroys America, or we destroy the deep state. That's the way it's got to be. We're at a very pivotal point in our country. Either we descend into a lawless abyss of open borders, rampant killings, super hyperinflation, which is what we have right now and not coming down, and festering corruption, or we evict Joe Biden and the Democrats from the White House and we make America great again.
So that's Donald Trump speaking in Waco, Texas this week, George. What do you make of his bid to become president? He seems to be getting more and more feisty about calling out these institutions that often it's conspiracy theorists, apparently, who talk about something called the deep state, the permanent government, the military-industrial complex, that sort of thing. In fact, he used the expression military-industrial complex in his in his talk as well, and he was, I think, he's bringing up this whole issue of who's really in charge. He's also on the record as saying, well, the Ukraine war would never have happened under his watch, and if he's made president, he'll stop it.
Yes, that's right. He obviously knows from his own personal experience that the deep state tried to do him in. First, they tried to do him in before the election in 2016. Then they tried to do him in immediately after the election, again, by cooking up the Russiagate hoax the Mueller investigation, and then they tried to do him in with the Ukraine gate, and they impeached him for Ukraine. So he knows that that they're going to be there waiting for him to destroy him. If he would ever to become president in 2024. And as you say, he's also brought up the Ukraine issue, and in a very interesting way, because in one interview with Sean Hannity, when he said that had I been president, this wouldn't have happened, I would have made some territorial concessions. Some of the areas that were Russian speakers, they could have been separated from Ukraine. That was quite an explicit statement from him. Sean Hannity kind of cut that out when he aired some of the interview for television. But then he's gone on record to say that he would insist on an immediate ceasefire, which is obviously complete anathema to U.S. policymakers, NATO, and so on. He's got a lot of enemies, and they're going to come after him. I mean, he caught them by surprise in 2016. They were ready for him in 2020, but they're going to be ready for him even more ferociously now. So he's got a very tough road ahead of him, because we had the indictment from New York, from the Manhattan district attorney yesterday, but that's the first of many indictments. There are going to be lots more indictments. There's going to be the indictment in Georgia. There's going to be a federal indictment, and there may be some more indictments. Maybe the New York State Attorney General will indict him. So they're going to hit him with so many different criminal indictments that he's going to be bogged down fighting off all these cases. It's going to cost him a lot of money. He's going to have to hire all kinds of lawyers, but it's also going to drain his energy. I mean, it's going to be very tough for him.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, George. I mean, maybe if you and I were hit with those indictments, it would drain our energy. But in a way, Trump seems to be energized by these things, and he almost seems to come out. One of the things I loved about his speech, I mean, I didn't love a lot of the things he was talking about, migrants and things like that. This is really, it's actually just nonsense, a lot of it. But it's the fact that he does speak from the heart, off the cuff. He's not reading an auto cue. He's not reading a script, is he?
Right. No, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I think that he is very genuine, and that's always been his calling card. And that's, I think, is undermining Ron DeSantis, who has been hailed as the sort of the Trumpism without Trump, is that he comes across as a professional politician. He is unable to sound authentic. You always get a sense that everything he says is first poll tested. He's had his marketers and publicists work with him. So he doesn't have the authenticity that which Trump has. But you raise a good point about is Trump energized by all these criminal cases, and does that make him stronger, or is it going to have an effect on him? He's not that young. I mean, he's not. No.
But I mean, it's bound to have an effect on the electorate, George, isn't it? Well, a lot of them are looking at it and saying, "Hang on, they're trying to get this guy," and that may actually have the opposite effect that the public prosecutors want it to have.
Right, that's true, and that could very well happen. The other side to it is that there are people in the middle who, even if they have sympathy for Trump and that they're out to get him, may just think, hey, we can't take another 4 years of this. This is just exhausting. This is going to be like this forever. Every single day is going to be just this constant battle between Trump and the media, Trump and the prosecutors, Trump and the deep state. It's just exhausting. And there's a lot of people who just prefer a quiet life.
Well, that's true.
So if he were to win and take office in 2025, that means he'd be there till 2029. And then other people say that means we will have had 15 years of nonstop Trumpian drama. And, you and I might enjoy it and think, great, makes life interesting, but not everybody thinks that.
Well, I don't find it. I find it actually boring, really boring, watching another fake indictment which comes to nothing. I mean, that's what has happened so far. We've had lots and lots of hot air, and this seems to me to be the idea, is that, they're trying to put this stuff in the press, and it may be backfiring. But anyway, just looking at the actual what's going on over in Ukraine, we've heard today that President Zelensky says that if he uses Bakhmut, he will be pushed to compromise with the Russians. Talking to the Associated Press, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told AP, actually it's on Wednesday, not today, that if the Donbas city of Bakhmut falls to Russia, he'll be pressured to compromise with Moscow. Our society will feel tired. It's like we were talking about the Trump camp getting tired with these indictments. If the Russians win in Bakhmut, Zelensky said, our society will push me to have a compromise with them.
Well, I don't believe anything Zelensky says. He is driven by two goals. The first step, to get as much hardware and money out of the United States and the rest of the NATO gang, as much of that as possible. So how does he do that? By warning, well, if we lose in Bakhmut, we don't get enough hardware, I don't think I'd be able to hold on for much longer. I'm going to have to sign a deal with the Russian. And, of course, he's calculating that the effect that will have is that the Americans will say, oh, my God, that's the last thing we want you to do. How much more do you want? So that's, I think he's driven by that. But his ultimate objective is, of course, to get NATO into the war directly, because ultimately he can't really win this war by himself. So his hope is, to get NATO directly involved in the fighting.
I mean, I don't know if you've seen the war maps. I'm sure you have, actually, George. Bakhmut is really surrounded, and in fact, the Russians seem to have left a kind of corridor for the Ukrainian troops to escape if they wish to. So they haven't totally. I mean, they've got it as surrounded as you can be. But they seem to be allowing, saying, well, look, if you want to go, guys, go. But, we've got all the territory around the city, including several miles to the west. So if you want to go west, you can go through a little corridor we've left for you. But you may as well leave, or, if you don't want to die.
Well, no, I think so. But I'm not sure that that's the most effective strategy on the part of the Russians, because all that'll happen is that, they'll leave. And then they'll dig in somewhere else a few miles to the west. I mean, that's really been the way this war has continued. My own personal feeling is that Russia has to win this war. It has to wrap it up. The only way to win this is by the use of overwhelming force, whether overwhelming use of infantry, overwhelming military equipment, hardware. But it has to be done, to the point where really there is no escape, but that's not what has happened, and ultimately there hasn't been very much progress for quite a number of months. So I'm a little less sanguine as to the outcome of Bakhmut, particularly as I think that Ukraine will mount a counteroffensive sometime in April. I don't know whether that'll be successful, may well not be successful, but it will happen.
Is that with more equipment from the West? Is that all coming in nicely?
Yes, it is coming in from the West, and the Western powers want this counteroffensive. I mean, they're calculating that if they can force some kind of a major setback on the part of the Russians, and either Russia will be forced to the negotiating table and they will essentially admit defeat, or admit that they're unable to win this war and then therefore they want to get out of it. Or ultimately, as I was saying earlier, they want to inflict such a humiliation on Russia that it will lead to regime change in Moscow.
Okay,
so there's no question that Zelensky is under pressure from the United States to mount an offensive, and very soon.
So what's your thoughts about, I mean, obviously you were based in Eastern Europe. How has the Ukraine war gone down in Eastern Europe, do you think, in countries like Romania, in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, places like that, which were old Soviet countries? I mean, what is their view of what's been going on over in Ukraine? Some of them, I would imagine, are looking at it and saying, well, actually, good on the Ukrainians giving the old Soviet masters a bloody nose. Others, not so sure. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that in Eastern Europe, the attitude are very similar to Western Europe, which is I think that the public is not on the same page as the leaders. The leaders are all on board with NATO, but the public is really quite skeptical. They are suffering the consequences of the war through inflation. They're obviously also very nervous that the war could spill over and that it's going to affect them. And there isn't any real sympathy for Ukraine, but the leaders, they go to all these meetings and say, yeah, we need whatever it takes, we have to support Zelensky. I don't think that's the mood of the public in Eastern Europe any more than it is in Western Europe.
I mean,
the one political leader who has expressed this view is Viktor Orban of Hungary. The problem is, of course, that Hungary is quite a small country and therefore is of limited influence. But nonetheless, I mean, he has said that that the view of Europeans, they want this over, and they want inflation to come to an end, and they want to get back to normality, and they don't want this war to go on.
Yes. So, I mean, if you look at for example, what's been going on in the meantime over in the Middle East, there seems to be some rapprochement between countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has almost been happening on the sidelines of this. So, and I'm also wondering whether some of these Eastern European leaders aren't thinking, well, let's just agree with the Americans for now. I mean, let's face it, this was Putin's tactic after 2000. Let's just be friends. Let's join the G8 and things like that. But actually, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, well, at some point, they may be fair weather friends, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that they feel that they're getting a decent enough deal out of it. I mean, they're handing over all these weapons, and then they imagine that the Americans are going to replace them with all that Soviet stuff that they handed over. It'll be replaced by top-of-the-line American equipment. That will happen, but the Americans are going to charge them a pretty penny for it. They're not just going to give it away. But there's no question that they want to keep in with the Americans because they're afraid of the Americans. I mean, the Americans can do all sorts of very nasty things if you don't toe the line. I mean, Viktor Orban hasn't toed the line. I mean, they're plotting to overthrow him all the time. And he has more or less. He's gone along with NATO and the EU. He's just carved out little special dispensation for him on oil and on some other sanctions. But basically, he's gone along with NATO and the EU. And even so, he's the constant target of American plotting. We had USAID Director Samantha Power here a few weeks ago, throwing around money like confetti to all sorts of anti-Orban groups. And Hungary wasn't even invited to Biden's Democracy Summit. So I think that a number of these East European leaders are worried that if they fall out with the Americans, they're going to be the target of color revolutions.
Ah, right. Yeah, may well be. Also, I mean, the Americans must be fuming today because the Chinese have brokered an Iran-Saudi Arabia reconciliation effort. Now, on the official side, the US is saying that one of their Middle East envoys is saying that they're very hopeful that the Saudi-Iran détente will help the region. But actually, behind their backs, surely they're fuming.
Yeah, of course they're fuming. You'd have to say, though, they brought this on themselves. The Biden administration pursued a very hostile policy toward Saudi Arabia, but without doing the commensurate thing, which is to improve relations with Iran. So Biden, who had promised vaguely during the 2020 election that he would return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran and the denuclearization of Iran, negotiated with Iran. It went nowhere. So America hasn't returned to the JCPOA. But at the same time, Biden went out of his way to piss Mohammed bin Salman off. And the Saudis are really, quite tired of this. I mean, the Saudis really don't like being essentially America's cat's paw. But Biden made a fundamental blunder in bringing up the whole issue of Khashoggi. There was absolutely no reason to obsess about Khashoggi. It was basically kind of a Saudi dissident. He was a Saudi power player, but and came to a no good end. Well, that happens. But Biden made a whole to do about it. And so, he's had very poor relations with Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia had good relations with Trump. So it makes sense. I mean, you can go among Iran and Saudi Arabia. You take one side or take the other side, but you've got to pick. But if you antagonize both, well, then you get what you've got now, which is a reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Martin, what do you think? It's interesting, isn't it? The Saudis and the Iranians and the Israelis actually starting, because the Saudis have got good relations with both now.
Well, I think by forming a relationship with the Israelis are not very happy about what's happened. But of course, the big player in all of this was the Chinese, because it was all signed off in Beijing. And that, of course, does signpost the future, doesn't it? Because the Chinese have got lots of resources to resolve conflicts. They see that, and their peace plan for the Ukraine, which was dismissed immediately by the Western powers, it was basically saying return to the Minsk agreements, which Germany and France and the UN Security Council said was the way forward back in 2014, 2015.
Saying it all along, haven't
they?
And
of course, we can't go back to that because the Russians, quite rightly, are not prepared to do deals with people who don't stick to deals they've done already. So that's why we can't do anything there.
I mean, in my view, this kind of is a bit of a pat on the back for Jeffrey Sachs, saying, well, a lot of this is really about China, because the Chinese are sitting and watching what's going on in Ukraine and the mistakes and blunders made by Biden, and they're cashing in on all of it. But anyway, on the Scott Ritter programme, he does a weekly programme with Judge Napolitano this week, the former US Marine Corps intelligence officer and the weapons inspector in the Iraq war who resigned because he said there were no weapons of mass destruction before the war started, Scott Ritter. He was talking to Judge Napolitano. It'd be good to get your comment after this about what's going on with Taiwan particularly, and generally with China.
To Taiwan, Admiral Paparo, as you know, you probably know him personally, is, I don't know the rank other than 4 stars, but he's in charge of the Pacific Fleet. So he's got a humongous sense of responsibility. Here he is. We have a couple of clips. The first one, she asks him about whether he talks to his Chinese counterpart.
If the U.S. and Chinese militaries can't communicate over a Chinese spy balloon, then what's going to happen when there's a real crisis in the South China Sea or with Taiwan?
We'll hope that they'll answer the phone. Else, we'll do our very best assessment based on the things that they say in open source and based on their behavior to divine their intentions, and we'll act accordingly.
Doesn't that make the situation even more dangerous if U.S. and Chinese militaries are not talking?
Yes.
Okay, before you give us your views on the substance of what he said, should an active duty 4-star with tens of thousands of troops under his command and billions of dollars worth of ships under his command be giving an interview to a national news organization on camera like that?
I respect Admiral Paparo enough to say that he didn't do that interview without getting it cleared with his with Pentagon first. Look, he is the combatant commander of one of the most important theaters of operations in the United States. That's the Pacific Theater. This is a big deal. He's a big man. He has a lot of power, a lot of influence, and he knows that. He would have been picked for that job if he was somebody who was just bumbling along. He's not the kind of guy that's going to go out and get an interview of this high profile without first clearing it with the Pentagon and indeed the White House, the National Security Council. Every message he gave during this presentation was a message that the White House wanted him to impart on the American public and the Chinese. This was an act of diplomacy that took place here. He is sending a signal to the Chinese, communicating basically his unease at the fact that they're not communicating and trying to let them know that there is some consequences for this failure to communicate.
Is it believable that there's no back channel communications going on between an admiral of this rank and his counterpart in the Chinese Navy? I mean, he's in Guam. The interview takes place in Guam, so he's way out there. It's not like
his headquarters is in Hawaii, actually. Pretty nice headquarters. But so he's just visiting Guam right now. It's not the position of the admiral to have back channel communications. That's beyond his remit. I believe there are back channel communications that are probably may run by William Burns, the CIA director, probably operated out of the National Security Council, maybe from the White House itself, that there are back channel communications, at least attempts to do so. But China's dismissive of the United States altogether. Biden can't get Xi to answer the phone. So if the president of the United States can't get, the Chinese leader to answer the phone, don't be surprised that the commander of the Pacific Fleet can't get his counterpart to answer the phone. Hopefully there's something going on akin to what we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where John F. Kennedy had a back channel opened up with Nikita Khrushchev that was kept out of the limelight. The fact that you and I don't know about it hopefully means that it's happening. It's happening successfully.
Well, I wonder, but I mean, there's a sort of backdrop to that conversation, George, where he's suggesting that the CIA and Burns at the CIA is chatting with the Chinese, but the president can't. I mean, he can't even get President Xi to pick the phone up, apparently.
Well, I mean, the problem for the Biden administration is that it's going out of its way to antagonize China. What it's doing in Taiwan right now is quite similar to what the United States was doing to Ukraine, really, for many years before 2022. They're pursuing what's known as the porcupine strategy, which is, you keep arming and arming and arming Taiwan to the point where it becomes very difficult. It will become very difficult for China to mount any kind of a military offensive against Taiwan. Why would it want to mount a military offensive against Taiwan? Well, China has outlined what is its red line on Taiwan. If Taiwan declares independence, then it will be forced to resort. It would have to resort to force. Now, if you continue to arm it, then it's going to be very difficult for China to do anything about it. So it's kind of similar to what was going on with Ukraine. I mean, you keep arming it, creating this very hostile state on Russia's borders until it reaches the point when Russia feels this can't go on. Because in no time, this will be a very heavily armed warship with its guns pointed at us. We have to do something about it now. And this may well happen at some point in the near future with Taiwan. And given, we now have the Taiwan president visiting the United States, the Taiwan president will probably meet Kevin McCarthy, who's the number 3 in the pecking order in the United States. And then we had Speaker Pelosi a few months ago visiting Taiwan. So the Americans are really building up Taiwan, and they're sending in their military hardware. So at what point does Xi decide that we can't allow this to continue? So, a Ukraine-style conflict could well be coming in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that's a definite possibility. I think if you look at the Chinese proposals for the resolution of the Ukraine crisis, they were suggesting going back to the Minsk agreements, which would have allowed the breakaway republics in the East Ukraine to have autonomy, but within a Ukrainian official de jure state. And that, of course, is the solution for Taiwan. If the Taiwanese government accepts that they are de facto part of the Chinese, that they're part of the Chinese setup, but they have independence within that. And at the same time as the president of Taiwan was visiting the United States, the opposition former president from the Kuomintang political party, he's visiting China for the first time since 1949. And he went to the mausoleum of Sun Yat-sen, who's the grandfather of both the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party. And of course, in the past, they were in alliance together against Japanese imperialism. So I think there's going to be an election in Taiwan, not this year, but next year, I believe. And the KMT have done quite well in the local elections. And what their pitch to the Chinese, the population in Taiwan itself is, let's not pick fights with the Chinese. Let's try and find a way to live with them. And of course, their position has always been that they don't want Taiwan to be independent because they see themselves as the legitimate government of the whole of China. Now, all of these things are messy. These things are always messy. Azerbaijan versus Armenia is quite messy, but it's all resolvable if people have got the right attitude. But of course, we've got a belligerent attitude, just knee-jerk belligerence coming out of the Western deep state.
George, I'd love to know what you make of the climate talks, because obviously the Chinese are looking at this and saying, well, hey, this is all aimed at us, really, isn't it? We're the big industrial power in the world, and what you're telling us is that we're going to have to shut all this down.
Well, it's exactly right. And I mean, China takes that view and India takes the view, which is that, you got very rich using fossil fuels, cheap energy, and now you want to prevent us from becoming rich using fossil fuels and cheap energy. You decided, you've acquired religion and say, oh no, we have to have green, we have to have net zero emissions and so on. So the Chinese say, yeah, this is how you always do everything. You get rich, and then you announce that, but no one else can get rich using our methods. And this is the way it's always done. It's a little like on the issue of war crimes. The worst war crimes have been committed by the Western powers, but then they get more and more sophisticated military hardware, which enables them to perform more accurate military targeting. And then they say that anybody else who's using less sophisticated hardware are guilty of war crimes because they're causing indiscriminate casualties, the very indiscriminate casualties that the Western powers had themselves done for centuries. So it's always this kind of hypocrisy that you say, no, we've done all this, but now nobody else is the right to have it, and we will judge you for your sins.
Nobody seems to call this out in the Western press at all, bizarrely. I mean, even though I think we could really do with a kind of international comedy program which points out some of the hypocrisy that's going on and the sycophancy of the press in simply not making the very basic, simple comments like the one you've just made. Anyway, just to wrap up, I'd like to look at the World Economic Forum a bit and also the financial situation. So let's go back to a guest we had earlier on before the break, Heiko Khoo. He does the Marxist tours of London on every Sunday, and he also is a regular speaker at Speaker's Corner, as well as he did have a program, Speaker's Corner program on the London radio station Resonance FM, to hear what he has to say about what he thinks is now going on with the World Economic Forum, because he thinks that there is a kind of backlash against it going on at the moment, particularly in Europe.
There are a lot of people who argue that Klaus Schwab and co. are commanding the trajectory of the world. And I think there is an element of that within the dystopian utilization of technology and the advance of key sectors, for example, pharma and AI and tech. On the other side, these are the trajectory is now inverted. I think the COVID pandemic was the peak of globalization. So this was as far as they're going to be able to go in terms of having the world on board to do their bidding. And then the war on Ukraine is the splintering. It's the consequence of that attempt to unify the entire world behind jabs and vaccine passports and segregation. That was the peculiarity of it. So the way in which the unification of the world under Schwab and Co. appeared in its ultimate phase was the global splintering of the splintering of the world. You know, the European Union ending up as borders with PCR tests and lockdowns and God knows what, you know. And I think that's the inversion of that is taking place. The inversion of this was the inversion of globalization, the splintering of the world and the division of the world into subsections. Now, the European Union, for example, van der Leyen was talking today, saying about, we need to be wary of China, but the Spanish are out in China. The Germans are making deals with the Chinese. They're no doubt discussing Ukraine with the Chinese. And they've got a lot of interest in common with the Chinese. And if the Americans, there was an article in FT again today, quite a good article, discussing, well, what country can actually isolate itself? And really, the United States is only the only country that can really just like, look, let's sort them all, we're having nothing more to do with it. And only 25% exports, simply dependent on exports. So they can easily deal with that. They've got their own oil and gas. They don't need to worry about the rest of the world if they don't want to. So there is an internal pressure. If Donald Trump or another Republican comes to power, then that pressure will increase. And they don't want to. A lot of Americans don't want to have anything to do with the war in Ukraine. And they don't care if Taiwan is Chinese or not Chinese. And so consequence of that is, I think, the splintering of the world will be exacerbated even more. The European Union will take a slightly different trajectory and have its own internal crises, a different trajectory to the Americans. And it's a tumultuous world, and it'll continue being a tumultuous world. And the Chinese will continue to grow because the internal structure of the Chinese economy is based on public ownership and planning. And that is a powerful mechanism for developing an economy, particularly in more backward countries like India and much of Africa, who will look to China for investment and for development, both as a model and for resources.
Okay, that's Heiko Khoo, and I'll put a full interview up on our show page later this evening at thisweek.org.uk. What do you make of his analysis there, though, George? I mean, he's saying effectively that the COVID pandemic was the peak of globalisation. Now, we're talking now about increasing fracturing.
Well, I don't know, because there was already quite a lot of fracturing even during the COVID era. The relations between Russia and the West continued its downward spiral. I don't think that was in any way affected by COVID. I mean, although they were on the same page, Russia and the West, they all took the pandemic seriously. The Russians, I think, were even the first to come up with I think they were the first to patent a vaccine. But I don't think that affected the geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. So, and I don't see, to be honest, the United States and Europe going their separate ways. I think they're absolutely locked in for the foreseeable future.
Well, Martin is nodding there, but I'd like to just finish with Catherine Austin-Fitts, if you don't mind, George, giving her take on what she believes is the sort of long-term plan of the banks. I mean, she's very focused on the financial system as a former advisor herself in the US government about finance, and what she's saying here, I think, is that there is a kind of end game that the financial oligarchy is working towards, and she kind of tries to chart it here on the high wire with Del Bigtree last week.
We're in a political process where the people who run the financial system have engineered a financial coup. We should have gotten concerned 20 or 30 years ago, but we've been kicking the can. And now their way of dealing with letting us down, sort of managing our expectations, is to cancel currency and go to a financial system with complete control. So they want to be able to control, they want to be able to turn your money off and on, which they can do in an all-digital system. And what we're now seeing at the state level is real pushback by consumers, by citizens, by state legislators saying, we don't want to be controlled by an all-digital system. There's a huge push to continue to make sure to preserve cash, not just in the United States, but in Europe, because an all-digital system gives ultimately the people who control the central banks and the banking system an ability to literally turn on and off your money if you don't do exactly what they say. And exactly what you say includes taxation without representation, healthcare mandates, and literally taking away your kids.
Well, this is the bigger picture, maybe, George. What do you make of the sort of attempted change to the central bank digital currencies?
Yeah, I think that's the goal, to move towards digital currency. And again, it's very interesting that the sort of supposed leftish parties, the Annalena Baerbocks, they're the ones who are pushing the hardest for an all-digital currency. Sure, there are people who don't want it because it's going to be a disaster. But there will be powerful forces, the banks, the big internet giants, all of the financial interests who want to go down this path of the digital currency. So it'd be kind of interesting. I'm actually quite skeptical whether a cash economy will survive, because there are much more powerful interests pushing for digital currency, and the sort of liberal progressive opinion seems to favor a digital currency.
Martin, it almost seems as if the crises are being deliberately created to create a massive economic crisis, maybe simply a little bit like 2000 in Argentina or the 1990s in Russia, where people are robbed of their savings, etc., if they've got any, and they're in a situation where they will pretty much take any solution, and in which case the financial oligarchy come in and say, all right, you're going to take our electronic money system now.
Well, the implication of what Jeffrey Sachs has been saying about how COVID-19 itself is a bioweapon leak from a US laboratory. He's claiming at the moment this is accidental rather than deliberate. But of course you can see the whole pattern. If it was deliberate, it's a deliberate attempt to sabotage the Chinese economy in the first place, and secondly to create the conditions for this World Economic Forum, Great Reset, digital currency, etc. But of course, what's actually been provoked is the creation of an alternative money system. Sergei Glaziev, who's working for the Russian government, talking to the Chinese about developing commodity currencies, which will be outside the purview of the US dollar. And of course, I still think that drug gangs in Latin America are going to carry on using cash, whatever they say.
Good point. Anyway, George, I wonder if you could just wind up by letting listeners know where they can follow you, where they can find you, your commentary, etc.
Right. You can find me. I do a podcast with Peter Lavelle. It's on Locals, thegaggle.locals.com. And you can find us also on YouTube, or The Gaggle on the YouTube. I also have my own YouTube channel. You can find me there. You can also find me on Substack. And you can also follow my Twitter feed.
Got any books out in English?
Yeah, my book, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia.
Okay, George Szamuely speaking to us live from Budapest in Hungary. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, George. And final item tonight is David Livingstone, the author of Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. As I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, but there's a little excerpt in here where he talks about these. Well, I mean, it's difficult to know how to describe them exactly, the order of the 9 angles. You might just simply describe them as satanic death squads.
The order of 9 angles openly advocate human sacrifice. What they also advocate is infiltrating all kinds of groups. And so this is what been doing recently. They've been infiltrating a number of fascist groups, neo-fascist terrorist groups. One of them is the Otto Waffen group. which is new. So there's a growing network of international neo-fascist groups, and so this is how one of them is connected with is the Azov battalion that played a key role in the so-called resistance happening in Ukraine. So this is a network now they sort of converge on a forum called the Iron March Forum that was founded recently, I think 2015 or something like that. And Iron March was founded by a follower of Alexander Dugin. So this is where you get the contradiction of Dugin, openly denouncing the Nazi influence in Ukraine, which is very true. But what he is not telling you is that he comes himself from a background of Nazi sympathy with numerous affiliations with Nazi heritage, particularly the Polar heritage, which he openly advocates, and his influence in this growing network of neo-Nazi terrorist groups. Dugin was also affiliated with a guy named Kerry Bolton, and Kerry Bolton is the official distributor of the Order of Nine Angles. So again, this is how they're all connected. So to get back to your friend Nick Land, all these groups advocate a political doctrine known as accelerationism, and that again is the idea that they need to accelerate the coming of the end times, and they do so by carrying out acts of terrorism. And
this is so human sacrifice for them. It's like a badge of honor.
Yes, they're Satanists, right? It's hard to wrap your mind around it, but it's hard to understand. If you can put yourself in the mind of Satanists, where killing a child is a positive work, right? Murdering an innocent person is a positive.
How do they justify that to themselves?
I do not know. But that's going back to the same old mystery. There's not one I can explain.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to explain that sort of thing. And we've had, of course, a shooting in Nashville this week. Nashville, Tennessee, with 3 young children shot, dead, by someone who was transgender, although there seemed to be a real great reluctance for particularly the BBC to talk about that in the press. I mean, when you look at the various people who have been involved in these shootings, many of them have had some sort of history of mental health problems. I noticed that the Nashville shooter was under some sort of medical supervision for a psychological problem. David Livingstone's books, there's various of them out there. He's kind of an essential person, really, in that there doesn't seem to be anybody else who's done anything like a brilliant job in actually tracking the networks and the individuals of the occult over the centuries. I mean, literally, right back to things like, the First World War, the Second World War, and the interest groups, including Theosophy, that seem to have so many links to, so for example, the creation of the Nazi Party, creation of the big German nationalist dream of the 1920s and 1930s, that enabled the Second World War to happen and the Nazi Party to take control. So Livingstone's work, I think, is just absolutely top-notch. He's also done this brilliant book, which is a kind of spiritual background to all of it. I am biased. I find he explains things better than anyone else I've ever come across in this realm, which is the dying God, where he looks at this whole idea of the Canaanite religion, which was spread around by the Phoenicians and people like that, about the sun gods. So the idea was, basically they were conning people to go and worship the sun. I don't think they even really believed it themselves, but they had to have sacrifices, including child sacrifices to the sun god, and then it was supposed to be a miracle every day when the sun came up again. So that was what many people were kind of conned into believing for thousands of years. By these people. Anyway, time to sign off now. Thanks to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, also to sound engineer Dave Bazanko, and to George Szamuely over in Hungary. Download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like. Do please send me interviews, story tips via not the BCFM Politics show page, where you also find the podcast, full-length interviews, story links, comment page, and our email addresses. You can subscribe to my weekly email list too, unless you're on Google. I'm going to have a good old look at exactly how you can do it if you're in Google. I'll send a letter off to my service provider. Hopefully, next week's show on Good Friday will be live, and I can give you a bit of information about, if you're a Gmail user, what you can do in order to get the weekly link, because Google are blocking them. Even if you've subscribed to my channel, they managed to intercept the emails and delete them somehow. Anyway, the show page is thisweek.org.uk. My books are available in print. That is The Siege of Heaven Reader, which is history of secret government from Cromwell to the Princess Diana assassination, and also The Traitors of Arnhem, Martin Bormann and the Bilderbergers. This is a link between the Nazis and the Bilderbergs, and the Battle of Arnhem. So we've been streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokescroft in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream, and at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey. Also on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. If you can restream us live or rebroadcast us, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Do please join us for Not the BCFM Politics Show at 5 o'clock next Friday, Good Friday. God bless, and don't let the Auto Abkeo banksters get you down.